Now we go on to the final speaker, Sara Flounders. Sara is a longtime political activist and author based in New York City. She's the leader of the United National she's a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center, and is the author of numerous books, including most recently, Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, co-authored with Lee Soo-hin, and NATO in the Balkans, Voices of the Opposition, co-authored with Ramsey Clark. She writes regularly for Workers' World. Sara, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you to the International Manifesto Group. As the final speaker, I have a chance to recap a few points. First, who is responsible for the massive destruction of the Korean Peninsula? Not a building left standing in the north. US imperialism, we all agree. Who is responsible for the death of 5 million Koreans in the Korean War? And who's responsible for the division of Korea to this day? Since September 1945, who maintains this division, this forever war, this forgotten war? It's US imperialism. With tens of thousands of troops, Camp Humphrey, the largest overseas US military base in the world, and 72 other bases, they exist to keep Korea divided and to ensure decades of guaranteed profit to the US military industrial complex. Who is responsible for the economic sabotage and shortages, even of essential supplies of food and medicine in the DPRK today? 70 years of US sanctions. Now, US imperialism did not act alone. The British Commonwealth Army, for example, took part in the War of Korea. British, Canadian, Australian troops in the tens of thousands. And to this day, they politically defend their criminal role, and they play a role in the economic sabotage and sanctions. What is needed is a strong, clear, consistent voice of a united anti-war, anti-imperialist movement that stands with the people of Korea and against US war, sanctions, and the division of the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK deserves the support of all those who cherish self-determination and the right of every country to decide its own destiny. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has refused to be intimidated by US imperialist government and its threats to the sovereignty and its socialist construction. From 1950 to 1953, the United States, using the cloak of the United Nations, bombed every structure in the North over one story. Millions were killed, and yet the Korean people would not bow down. And what's important is that US imperialism was stopped. They failed in this war. This war, they were determined to turn back the revolutionary wave that was sweeping Asia, not only Korea, but through China and Vietnam. This was their road into Asia, and they failed. So it's important to remember that this was the first big US imperialist failure. The forces led by Kim Il-sung liberated the North and began socialist construction, while US troops occupied the South and installed a whole series of corrupt, repressive governments. Now let's look at the role of the corporate media. From liberal to reactionary, their role is to discredit the leadership of the DPRK and cover up the amazing progress made by this socialist country. US strategy is to completely stifle and crush the sanctions, but crush through sanctions. But rather than being crushed, the leaders of the DPRK say that the sanctions, which are the hardest of any of the 39 countries where the US imposes sanctions, they're the harshest, but it's only strengthened the determination of the Korean people to defend their sovereignty. This small country has successfully learned how to become self-sufficient in many areas. Sanctions became less effective through Juche, through the DPRK's self-reliance. It's pretty amazing. And despite the new sanctions, there are multiple new construction projects that have been completed all over the country. There's glimmering high-rise districts in Penang. There's new housing and schools and recreation areas in smaller cities and towns. There are greenhouses everywhere and urban agriculture. There are still difficult shortages and limited options, but the basic guarantees, DPRK has 100% literacy, the highest in the world, and healthcare is free. Now that is an incredible accomplishment. The crime is that the United States, one of the most highly developed countries in the world for over a century, can't yet provide decent education and medical care for its people. That's a crime. Now, what do we know from history? The Koreans are a distinct people who were united for thousands of years by language, culture, and geography, but they've been divided since 1945. We know that the DPRK will fight back if attacked. It has the will and the ability to defend itself. It's not going to surrender to threats. It never has. So how should we regard the nuclear capability of the DPRK? Well, it's a deterrent to a US attack, and it is therefore an anti-war measure. That's important to recognize. It was not the DPRK that introduced the first nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. During the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur actually proposed laying down a radioactive belt along the border with People's China. And since then, the Pentagon has organized semi-annual war games, they call them, by the US and South Korean military and everybody else they can possibly rope into it, that simulate an attack on the DPRK by nuclear-capable ships and planes. Now, the DPRK has studied other US agreements. They look at the world. They see that Iraq and Libya allowed outside inspectors to come in and verify the end of their weapons programs. And once they disarmed, then they faced the full force of NATO's immense firepower, resulting in over 1 million deaths in Iraq, and literally the return of open slave trade in Libya. How shameful, how outrageous. Now, the DPRK has never attacked the US. They have defended themselves against US aggression. The United States has sponsored a long line of military dictatorships in the South. But it is also important to recognize that the people's movement in the South did finally defeat the generals, and they at least ushered in civilian rule. This was a huge accomplishment. However, despite decades of a popular movement against military occupation, they are not yet able to rid the country of US troops and bases. That's why there's such a strong military presence in the South to this day. It's to stop. Today's occupation is a continuation of 150 years of US threats. The US war in Korea did not start in 1945. It started 150 years ago. In 1871, the US invaded Korea using gunboats, Marines, and superior firepower. It was US retaliation for the destruction of the heavily armed US gunboat, the General Sherman, 5 years earlier. This first warship was stopped by the Korean people. The Koreans surrounded this US warship with fireboats, small vessels stuffed with flaming straw and wood. They destroyed the invading Sherman and killed the whole crew. Now, this proud history with small fireboats, it continues today in the strike waves in South Korea. That's what they're like. They're like those small fireboats that continue. This past month, October 20th, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions called a one-day general strike. Tens of thousands demonstrated. Thousands of delivery workers turned off their apps and joined the strike. And what was their demand? The expansion of labor law to all workers, the abolishment of precarious work. Because after 70 years of capitalist development under US military and financial hegemony, a third of the workforce in South Korea are irregular, part-time, or temporary workers with few benefits. It's like the grim Netflix Squid Game, where millions are struggling to survive and pay crushing debt. So we need to think of solidarity with workers in US and other trade union organizations around the country, around the world, with the KCTU in their future actions. This kind of solidarity is crucial. Again and again, these waves of protests and of strikes have made significant changes, forced it through in the South Korean government. And it's important to recognize that South Korean people are largely supportive of peace with the DPRK, and they reject US provocations, and they seek to unite the peninsula. So in closing, I want to say it's also important to recognize that the DPRK has maintained a continuous position of dialogue and diplomacy with both Washington and Seoul, seeking to peacefully end the horrendous conflict that has divided the Korean people for over 70 years. In 1971, DPRK President Kim Il-sung proposed opening a dialogue between the North and South. In 1974, the Supreme People's Assembly of the DPRK proposed a formal end to the war. It was the US who ignored it. Progress was made again in 1994 with the official signing of the agreed framework between the DPRK and the US. The DPRK actually began to dismantle its uranium enrichment capacity. It was the US Congress who failed to meet its end of this signed agreement. They failed to help the DPRK develop peaceful nuclear technology for electricity generation. They failed to lift the sanctions and to normalize diplomatic ties. So, as I say, the position held by the DPRK for decades of inter-Korean dialogue, free from outside interference, is the way to achieve peaceful reunification, and it's the only clearly viable option. We need to recognize that the Korean people have every right to be free from US and Western imperialist interference, and from here to make clear demands that the United States remove all military personnel and equipment from the region, that there must finally be a peace treaty with the DPRK. Sign the peace treaty. The DPRK has survived despite massive destruction, decades of heavy sanctions from the main global superpower, and people of the world stand with Korea's long struggle for reunification, peace, and development. Our demand is US out.